Hello and welcome to today's episode on Healing and Growing Hand in Hand podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Tickle, and my guest today is Joanna Bieszczad. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes.
Close. Okay, great. Joanna, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast today. Let me give a little bit of her credentials. Her bio will be listed below as well, but she is a BABCP accredited senior CBT and EMDR therapist. And we'll get into the EMDR actually, because I'm doing that myself. She has 4 degrees in psychology and psychotherapy, 15 years in clinical work experience. And then there's 2 courses that you created on Udemy, which I'm actually following one of them, which is Reinvent Yourself by Boosting Your Self-Esteem. And we're going to get into that more today. I'm excited about that. The other course is How to Attract a Suitable Partner by Changing Your Mindset. And so today, the areas of discussion are going to be the self-esteem. We'll probably touch on trauma, obviously, and even on anxiety. And then the thing that I'm kind of excited about is a therapy that you do, which is EMDR. And I'm actually doing that myself, and it's been profoundly helpful in my healing journey. So thank you, Joanna, for like I said, participating in the podcast. You want to tell us a little bit more?
Yes, so I am CBT and EMDR therapist. I've been doing that for donkey's years now, and I've got experience in different areas. So I started in forensic psychology, actually assessing psychopathy. I was working in London in one of the units, forensic units there. Then I moved to working in national healthcare system in UK. And as a CBT therapist, and I moved to private practice and worked with perinatal women, with trauma. I work with a lot of insurance companies. So I work with people who are involved in car accidents or they had accidents at work.
Yeah. So there's definitely some trauma there. And it's just like with childhood trauma, it's not just necessarily childhood abuse, but it could be someone who was really sick, right? They spent a lot of time in the hospital or, close to death. And that's traumatic as well.
Yeah, that's true. And as well, watching someone else that we care about when we worry about their well-being, that can traumatize us as well.
That's true. I mean, I took care of my mom when she was dying of cancer, and I was young. I was 16 years old. And same with taking care of my father. And as much as I am glad I was there for them, it can be very, very traumatic.
Yeah. I worked with a lot of people actually who were going through the grieving process after they've lost parents to cancer or some other illnesses, and they've been traumatized by the whole experience. And I think that sometimes it is so difficult when you have to be in the hospitals and there are certain things that then play on your mind from that time. So it is quite common that people do get traumatized by that as well.
And there's such an underlying fear that whole time that you're taking care of the person, right? I mean, I just remember that with me, just having a fear of making sure I do everything right, making sure, I take care of them and they're not in pain. So it was, it still kind of weighs on me, you do the best you can.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, self-esteem. So you have a course on it, which I started, like I said, and I'm going to finish it. It's really good. I was really impressed. So what made you go into that area?
I think that my personal experiences, and I think that it wasn't like intentional at the beginning. It started with me growing up in communistic Poland, which was quite tough. Then having twin sister who was considered as brilliant. She could read fluently when she was 3 years old. As twins, you are always compared. And I was dyslexic. So I couldn't read for a long time. I was good at covering that up because I was learning all the reading by heart, all the stories that we're supposed to read. So no one actually figured out that I couldn't read, but I knew that. And I kind of felt as I wasn't as good as my sister. And then I think that in my 20s, I think that was my late teens and early 20s when I've noticed how low self-esteem affected me. And it was in different areas. It was in terms of relationships, in terms of jobs, in terms of studying, and so on. And luckily, one of my degrees I was doing on CBT for anxiety and depression. But one of the things that we touched on was a little bit of work on self-esteem. And there was one exercise there that when we were studying, we were actually encouraged to use the exercises that we were learning about on ourselves, so we can see what our clients would go through and how it feels to be on the receiving end as well.
Right.
And I did this one exercise, and when my self-esteem changed, I've noticed how everything started being different, better. And I think that because of my experience, I felt that it would be nice to share that knowledge. And, you know, it's not only one area of my life that actually improved. It was so many different areas in terms of my health. I started exercising and eating healthier. I doubled my salary. I had better relationships. My mood was better. So, you know, there is so many things that change. And I think that particularly being a woman, self-esteem, I think that it is something that we really suffer from lack of. We are bombarded with unrealistic images of those models, you know, with long legs and
perfect skin.
Yes. And, you know, it doesn't happen. Like, I've got stretch marks. I've got, you know,
I've got war wounds.
Like, this is how the real woman is actually.
Right.
So I think that, you know, we're struggling on many fronts as well. And I think that there is a pressure on us to do or be good at everything, be good mother, be work as well, and so on, and look perfect. And it's impossible. So our self-esteem suffers. And I've noticed that the huge problem then is how, when women have low self-esteem, how they treat other women. Others.
So true. Absolutely. And you know what the vision I get, that I get when you're talking about when your self-esteem changed, and how everything changed. It's like there's a filter on, right? There's a self-esteem filter that we have on when we're struggling with it. And that's how we see everything, is through that filter. And once you remove that filter and you start to have more confidence in your self-esteem does grow, you definitely see things different. You react different. You feel different, you know, and I know I've gone through, you know, some of that healing. There's obviously more I've got to do. I don't feel like you ever completely conquer it, but it has absolutely made a difference in my life. And that's why I'm excited about finishing your course, because I know it's only going to get better.
Yeah, it's actually, initially, I think it's how I structured the course. Initially, there are some techniques that are more like a quick fix, something that you can do straight away, but it's not core work. Then there is the second part that is more core work, deep work, and that's what that actually brings a long-lasting change.
Right. When you get to the root of the issues, you know, and with self-esteem, I mean, one of the things that pops up, and I think this is true with women, and you kind of touched on it a little bit as far as, you know, us comparing ourselves to others, and then there's jealousy, right? And don't you feel like when your self-esteem grows, the jealousy goes away? Like, it's rare for me to be jealous of someone anymore. Can you touch on that?
Yeah. And I think that I had that kind of realization when I think that it was a few years ago when I went to a spa hotel with two of my friends, and we were sitting at the table at the dinner. And there was this beautiful woman that walked in. I think that she had Chanel bag, she had nice shoes, and she looked stunning. And my friends, they started saying something derogatory about her and kind of saying, oh, that she's overdressed and look at her. And I was thinking in that moment, for me, the only thing that came across my mind was that what a beautiful woman. And I truly admire her without any other thought following that. And I was thinking, okay, I know that I'm in a good place, but I felt compassion for my friends, that they felt threatened by the situation, that they had to say something to make themselves feel better. And it is sad. It is quite, it feels unpleasant. I was that person as well a few years ago. I would be having the same comments, unpleasant comments, and feeling threatened by another woman. And I think that this is, unpleasant for the people who are experiencing this and the person who is on the receiving end as well.
Right. I totally can relate to that. That used to be me for sure. I used to be someone who would see a beautiful woman and, just go down the list of things of how terrible she is. Right. And in that moment, I have a feeling, oh, that makes me feel a little superior. But afterwards, I would feel horrible. And now I can appreciate a beautiful woman, a beautiful man. I mean, I can appreciate beauty and it doesn't threaten me. And when it does pop up, and it does every once in a while, and it's like I become aware, and I've said this over and over, and I'll continue to say it, but the healing journey and growing journey requires first and foremost self-awareness, right? And so having that, being aware of, ooh, I got a little jealousy. What's that about? And start looking inside as to why was I just triggered? Why? And work through it.
Yeah, and you're right here. Awareness is the first step always. So, when we are aware of something, we can then change it. So that's always the best step, to become aware.
And your friends, I mean, do you ever say anything to them about that? Like, if you would say something to them when you hear them saying this stuff, what would you say?
It's difficult because I think that even if I pointed that out, they wouldn't hear the message. A person has to come to that realization themselves. The only thing that I can do, I can support them and, tell them all the positive things about them and,
Right.
try to help them to grow to grow their own self-esteem. I think that it's tricky because, in this situation, if you say something to them, they might feel worse than they already feeling.
Right.
I think being a therapist, it's tricky because you don't sometimes say things because you understand where it's coming from,
Right.
and then you find more compassion, and it's difficult to challenge sometimes people in situations like that. The only thing that you can do, you can be there and try to make those people feel good about themselves, and I think that that's probably more productive. But it's tricky. I don't think that there are right and wrong answers. Yeah,
I agree. Because I brought it up because I thought, gosh, how would you handle that? And I agree. I mean, you don't want to call them out, right? That's not the thing. You don't want to call them out on what they're saying, but yes, supporting them where they're at. But anyway, it's interesting. And so the thing that keeps coming up for me though is and I'm such a feeler. I feel everything, right? Because I'm an empath. And the self-esteem, I can't say enough that once your self-esteem starts to grow and you can feel it, you can feel the confidence building in you. That's a motivating factor for me, is to continue to look at that and grow in those areas and see what areas that I'm lacking in that I need to work on.
Yeah, and I think that as well, you're going then as well to focus on the positive areas and on the things that you enjoy doing, on your true calling or on your passion, without worrying what other things about you. And I think that this is quite interesting one, because recently I read the book, The Top Regrets of the Dying. Bronnie Ware wrote the book, very good book, and I think that very good lessons to learn.
I'm sure.
On their deathbeds and their regrets. And one of the biggest regrets was that people felt that I wish that I was true to myself and live life on my own terms, or how I wanted, and not according to what others wanted of me. And I think that when you've got healthy self-esteem, you are in the place where you actually can do this, because you don't worry what other people think of you. You just follow your path and you focus on your path, and you listen to your needs and you listen to yourself more.
It seems like it's also a solution for people pleasing, right? That's been my thing that I've been working through. And as my self-esteem has grown, I'm not as concerned about people pleasing at all. And it's not like I have a careless attitude. I don't care what you think, but it's more like, this is really important to me. Period.
Yeah, I think that it is about setting healthy boundaries. And I like to see it that way.
Yeah. So we can switch gears here if you're ready to. And so we can talk about trauma, anxiety, or do you want to talk about EMDR?
Well, EMDR, I will be probably slightly controversial with my views.
Okay. Okay.
So we can start on that.
Yes. Yes.
So in terms of EMDR, it was quite interesting because when I was working for National Healthcare System, I had an opportunity to go to do EMDR training as part of my career development. And initially, when I heard about it, someone sitting there moving eyes from side to side and getting better, I was thinking, okay, that sounds a little bit hocus pocus to me.
A little magical.
Yes. But then at the training, one of the things that we did, we practice on each other, one therapist on another. Mm-hmm. And when I experienced that first time, I was thinking, oh my God, this is just amazing. But then I started thinking and working with EMDR quite a lot. And I realized that it's not EMDR that it's working, it's bilateral stimulation, which is only a small part of EMDR that is working. And bilateral stimulation is exactly when we stimulate different parts of the brain by moving our eyes from side to side or tapping the opposite parts of the body, or right. Auditory as well, having sound going from one ear to another. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking more and more about EMDR and the training. And one thing that I particularly was puzzled by was that part of the EMDR requires that you ask your clients to identify some negative cognitions and positive cognitions and so on, and as well to identify some tricky parts from the trauma or mm-hmm. the most difficult parts of the trauma. But that's actually quite difficult for someone who has been traumatized and they are very anxious, they suffer from PTSD. Mm-hmm. For them to kind of think about those things is not necessarily straightforward, and sometimes they don't know exactly what part of the trauma actually traumatized them.
They're so traumatized because it's so.
But sometimes
intense.
it can be as well different parts that they wouldn't even think that they are part of the trauma. So I had one client who, for example, one morning she was getting dressed and she was putting on a fresh underwear, and she was thinking to herself, her mom always told her, put the fresh knickers on if something happens, if you've got an accident. And that day she had an accident. She had a motorbike accident. And she wouldn't consider that part as a trauma if she spoke to any other therapist. But we kind of talk about what happened before the trauma as well. And it turned out that actually, because of that thought, she somehow had this thought in her head that she caused it. She caused the accident by thinking this thought. And it was actually part of the trauma. Or I had a woman who had car accident and she ended up in the hospital. She was unconscious. When she gained conscious, she was mortified about her cats that were at home and no one knew that they were left unattended. And she didn't know how long she was out of consciousness. And that was more scary than the whole accident. So,
that would be me.
Sometimes I've got a dog, that would be
that would be me.
So yeah, I can understand that. But sometimes people, they don't even think about it. You have to kind of let them tell you the whole story. Mm-hmm. And I think that with EMDR, it's only focused on the parts of what people assume were traumatic. So the actual accident and so on and so on. And I think that as well, asking people to think about negative cognition and introducing those terms even, it's unnecessary. When someone is there and they, barely can think, barely can concentrate because they are traumatized, they've got triggers, they are in that kind of fight or flight response. So my view on EMDR is slightly controversial in the sense that I do wonder whether, therapists, they do like making things more sophisticated or sound, quite important. And I do wonder whether EMDR is actually that kind of attempt, whether those other phases, because there are 8 phases of EMDR, are added there to kind of justify the long training as well, and to make it sound like a more scientific. But actually, what I've noticed from my clinical work is that only this part, bilateral stimulation, is the part that actually brings the relief and healing and reduces post-traumatic symptoms.
Mm-hmm. You know, it almost seems like it's obviously not a therapy that can be done when someone is maybe at the very beginning of their healing, when everything is just alive in them, you know, that the anxiety is over the top. Because when I think back, and it wasn't that long ago, I realized up until maybe 6-7 years ago, I was living completely on, what is the word? That is
Fight
so
or
fun.
flight.
Yeah, fight or flight. Yeah, I was constantly in that stress mode and just survival mode. That's the word I'm looking for. I was absolutely in survival mode. I lived my entire life in that. So if I tried to do something like this 10 years ago, it probably would not have worked well for me, because trying to dial down into the actual trauma itself and getting dialed in, what I found in the last year, I'm in a different place. And I think I was in the right place. I actually have the right therapist as well. But one of the things that I got out of this really is I got a voice. And I also learned to protect me. I didn't have anybody protecting me. And, you know, I would say to my therapist as we're doing this, I'm like, is this normal to like come to these conclusions? And, you know, she said, there's no wrong answer. But for me, that built my self-esteem. That built my confidence, you know. But I think I have definitely worked for years on this, and I was in the right place, because I think you're right. If you're on constant alert and constantly have anxiety, sitting there, remembering these memories and having those emotions and feelings come up can be absolutely overwhelming and can paralyze you.
Yeah, and I think that you have to feel that you're ready. But I think that as well, you know, even though some people, they are quite, you know, in that kind of fight or flight mode, with the right therapy setting, you know, when they feel contained, and when therapist teaches them as well some kind of techniques where they can bring those responses down, anxiety down,
Right.
then it is possible to go through that. But sometimes, you know, it's important that the therapist will make the process slightly slower and kind of adjust it to the clients.
Right.
But
Because
sometimes, yeah, with therapy, you have to be ready for it. And as you said, sometimes it takes some time to get to that point.
I mean, for me, I had to work through a lot of stuff, and be able to dial in on the last few roots that I had that were really affecting my life. And, you know, I mean, and I shared this story yesterday in a podcast that I just got triggered a few weeks ago. But what was huge for me is I became aware of it. When I was in the middle of that, I could feel it. And I actually looked over at my husband and said, this is crazy. I'm clearly being triggered, because the thoughts were just, they didn't make sense. It was illogical. You know, and I just said, and being aware of that, I could get myself calmed down. I could stop that loop, because you get into a loop, right? And I had to switch gears and go, okay, that makes no sense. And that is clearly not the right answer. What is the right answer? And I was in a safe place. I mean, there was no one else in my life I could have done that in front of, right? And just been real honest and said, I'm triggered. I'm being silly, you know?
But that kind of awareness is important, because then you've got a choice what to do, you know, whether you're going to use those techniques to help you to calm down, to bring the emotions down or not.
Right.
That's important.
Yeah, because I know when I look back, and I look back when I was triggered and I was completely unaware of being triggered, it felt like there was no other way out.
Yeah.
It's all I can say is it's a loop in your head and you can't see another way out. And that's why the awareness is first and foremost. Okay, I'm being triggered, and taking a deep breath and slowing it down, and whatever works for you, so that you can think clearly and you can see the other options that are in front of you, because there are options there.
Yeah, and in difficult moments when we've got very high emotional response, the first thing for us to do is to bring those emotions down, because we cannot think clearly. When I'm scared, terrified of something, like I cannot think clearly. So one thing is finding those kind of ways that work exactly as you said for you, that will bring those emotions down, and then you can have a different response.
Yeah, because I'll tell you that the emotions and feelings, the way that I describe it is it completely consumes me. Like it fills up every part of my body. It's crazy. That's the only way. And I just realized that just a few months ago when I was being triggered, and I felt it in me. And then there was another situation come up that I would normally be triggered in, and I wasn't. And I became aware of that. And that was like, the different feelings. It's just, that's what made me realize, wow, because I would go from 0 to very angry, and all I can say is it would just consume me. So
Yeah, so it shows that something was perhaps processed there. If the trigger doesn't evoke that emotion anymore.
right, and boy, is it freeing. It's so freeing. So let's talk about anxiety. What are your thoughts on it? Because I mean, do you agree that a lot of this trauma you can actually store in your body and it can come out as anxiety?
It can. And I think that there is probably something that I'm not that familiar with, but that kind of generational trauma. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is something stored, anxiety stored in the body through generation in some ways. Do you know something about that or?
Well, we can switch because you touched on something that I really find interesting, and that's the generational, right? So can you explain more about that? Because I find that fascinating.
Well, I always, that was another, I'm thinking example coming from Poland, of course, there was Holocaust there and Auschwitz, and, and I lived a couple of hours from Auschwitz. So I always think how that affected our genes, and whether that was passed, and whether that continues through generations. I wonder as well about other situations, not necessarily maybe as such tragic, but tragic in other ways.
Right.
But I haven't researched the subject. I've got so many things that I'm interested in.
I know that's one I'm interested.
I will put it on the list.
And it's interesting because I do believe that there can be generational. Yes, I do believe that. And I know in my own life, because in this last year, I've learned a lot about my mom. My mom was very mysterious. I lost her when I was 16 to cancer. And so I didn't really get to know her. And she was one of them that abused me. And so I really didn't get to know her. And so my dad's side, I know my dad's side really well. And I went on Ancestry, and looked it up, and my dad's, gosh, it goes all the way back to the 1700s, but my mom wasn't going anywhere. So I had to do research. It was the most bizarre thing. I don't know who her father was, and I don't know if she knew who her father was. So long story short, over the last couple of years, with a friend, we've done some research and found some really interesting stuff out about my mom. And it explained a lot about I'm sure, was abused just by seeing the history. Like, she didn't live with her mom, and her mom had children that I don't even know if my mom even knew about them, that she adopted out. So she, just reading the material that we found on her, I understood that she also was abused. It's very clear just by that. I know my father was abused. He told me he left home at 14 years old because of his father. And so that carried down obviously to me. And I shared this with my son recently. I even considered not having children because at 18, I was very aware that I was being abused, and I didn't want to carry that on. I was so afraid of carrying that on. And I had my son, but I just remember the minute he was born, I made a commitment to him. I would never abuse him. And we have a really great relationship, but it's taken a lot of work. And I know that because I was in survival mode those years growing up, I made a lot of mistakes, and there were things that I did that I'm not proud of. And I've talked to him about it.
We are human beings. We make mistakes. Yeah.
And I had to learn to forgive myself for being that person. Right. And so it's come full circle, and, but there is something to be said about the generational abuse.
Yeah, and I think that it is a lot of people actually, when they were abused as kids, they worry about whether they're going to repeat the pattern with their own kids, exactly what are you talking about. But luckily, a lot of people, they stop
Right.
at them, they make that conscious decision and they don't pass that generational trauma to their kids. I think that there was in my life probably as well some part of that. My grandmother committed suicide, and I think that affected my mom. But my mom, she doesn't speak much about it. But there is some kind of sense of sadness, and it comes out in other ways
right.
as well. That kind of unprocessed grief. Which must have affected me. And I think that I was an anxious child. And I think that the anxiety, the self-esteem, was related as well to anxiety. I was so anxious how others perceive me and whether I'm going to embarrass myself and make a fool out of myself, say something stupid.
Yeah.
That I was consumed by that when I was in my late teenage years and early 20s. People, they often don't realize about the treatment and that it can help them. And a lot of people, they feel that they are stuck with trauma. And I think that I've seen that so many times when people experience something traumatic. And even recently I had a client, she was actually hit by a car, which traumatized her. And she said, only recently, after she went through treatment with me and she no longer experienced PTSD symptoms, she realized how her life changed after the accident and how she was always nervous. And she told me that whenever she was spending time with her kids, she was doing that because she had to, but not enjoying it. And she said that her daughter recently told her, "Mom, you smile more often, and we've got so much fun with you." And she said that she started enjoying actually being a mom. But when she was stuck in the past 2 years, she thought that this is how her life is and this is how it's going to be. Only because she's going through the insurance claim, then she was offered therapy and she took it, and she noticed that actually things can be different. But I think that a lot of people, they don't even realize that you can change things. Yes, there is a difference between single trauma and complex trauma. And single trauma, so what we understand by that is when someone experienced one event, for example, someone got raped once, or someone was involved in a car accident, or someone had accident at work, or witnessed something traumatic. That's single trauma. But there is complex trauma. This is when people were exposed to trauma for a prolonged period of time and multiple events. For example, childhood abuse when it was happening on a regular basis, or when parents beating their kids and physically abusing them, and so on, or people who are living in the war zones. And complex trauma and single trauma are slightly different. I think that it's easier to treat single trauma. And I think that EMDR, or particularly bilateral stimulation, brilliant, it works well. And I've got almost 100% recovery rates for that. Wow. Complex trauma is a little bit more complex because with EMDR, yes, you can remove certain flashbacks or memories, unpleasant memories. And it's sometimes with EMDR, it feels like erasing those memories and those kind of unpleasant emotions. Or you can reduce how people respond to trigger, but that's only part of the work. Another part of the work is emotional regulation, how to self-soothe. Sometimes people, they've got strong physical bodily sensations, and that's another part of work. So I think that trauma is not the same, and treatment for trauma is a little bit different for single trauma and complex trauma. But I think that there is a treatment there, and it's good when people realize that they don't have to suffer, that they can do something about it. And nowadays, in terms of treatment as well, it's not only EMDR that is recommended. We've got neurofeedback that is proven to be effective. We've got psychedelics as well, all the research on that. And I was very skeptical at the beginning, but I'm thinking, if it helps people, I'm definitely after pro. So I think that there are various treatments available, and it's about finding the one that works for you. But as well, if you try one treatment and it doesn't work, then don't give up, because there is so many options to choose from. So I think that this is what I've noticed, that people with trauma, sometimes they kind of give up and they live their lives and they think this is how it is, this is how my life is going to be, which might come as well from that kind of learned helplessness. When you are, for example, young and you are abused, there is nothing you can do to take yourself out of that situation sometimes. And you learn that you can, try to do things, but nothing works. So you learn helplessness in that situation, and then you carry that throughout your life, and you think, I can't do anything about those things.
That is so true. And that's exactly what I did. I took that into, that learned helplessness. And also, what came to mind when you were talking about the trauma, because something that I've realized over the last year is I've had the whole timeline put in front of me. I put the whole timeline of growing up and the abuse, and realizing the depth of it. And it's not sit and have a pity party. It's like, oh yeah, I guess that was pretty bad, And as I'm talking to my therapist and I'm sharing stories with her and her reaction, sometimes I think the trauma happens to us and we don't realize it's trauma. Does that sound crazy? But I can just remember thinking, well, that was just my life. And now I look at it as an adult. Like I think about, would I want my son living like that? Oh, no way. Like now, then I see the depth of it. But sometimes when you're in it, you just don't see it until someone's saying to you, hey, that was really traumatic. You just seem like you're not really dealing with it, or, that it's going to come out somehow, right? It's going to come out somehow, some way. And so again, it goes back to that awareness, but sometimes stuff happens to us and somehow our brain just rationalizes it.
Yeah. And we kind of learn almost that, this is normal for us. This is what happened to us. We don't have anything to compare this to. And usually what happens when people actually have kids, when they see that 6-year-old daughter and they think, the stuff that happened to them when they were 6-year-old. And then you've got this kind of realization, oh my God, I was just a child.
Right.
And I couldn't protect myself. And this is usually very breakthrough moments for people when they realize that, that shouldn't have happened.
Right. And in my life, one of the things that really has helped me, I keep saying having a voice, but also having someone protect that little Lisa, because no one did protect her. And now as an adult, I can come in and I can self-soothe her. I can calm her down. I can protect her. I've got her back. And people say that, but until you really get it, once you get it, it's a game changer. It really changes the way you see everything and the way you think, for sure.
And that's exactly one of the big part of healing from complex trauma, exactly what you described, to be able to be in that position when you can look after this little child inside you and protect them and be there for them and so on.
Because so much of it is just, it becomes such a part of you, and you don't realize until, like you say, these moments when you have a 6-year-old daughter and you all of a sudden realize what was happening to you at 6 years old. It just becomes such a part of you. And so, the awareness again has been key for me and will continue to be.
Yeah. And I think that it's always, life is a process. And I think that we always grow. I don't think that, we ever feel like, oh yeah, finally I arrived.
I've arrived. Life is perfect.
Things are challenging throughout the life, and things change and circumstances change, and it's like ongoing process. It's just about I think that with healthy self-esteem, the one thing that we've got, we know how to look after ourselves a little bit better, or we make better choices for ourselves. Or I've noticed that when my self-esteem improved, then rather than when I was stressed, having a glass of wine and takeaway, now I do meditation and a warm bath. So it's very different how you look after yourself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that that's it's still related to self-esteem. But I think that when we experience something traumatic, it's going to have an effect on our self-esteem. I think that all those things, they are connected: self-esteem, trauma, anxiety, depression. It all can be very connected.
And one of the themes that I see going through all that is shame.
Shame, guilt. Mm-hmm.
And shame will shut you down for sure. It does, it does me,
Yeah. And it's quite common. Shame and guilt, very huge emotions, very common emotions when people experience something traumatic.
I've got shame down pretty good, but the guilt is still, it's just so deeply there. When I was, and it's funny because there's stuff that happened over the last week where I saw the guilt come up, and it was one of those emotions that really, it completely consumed me. I really had to, I realized, oh, that's one of those emotions that's completely filling me, and I don't like the way I feel. I gotta take a step back for a minute. Why am I feeling guilty? And I had to really get down to those emotions, and it was hard and it was painful. But then once I got to the root of it and I understood why I'm feeling guilty, it didn't completely go away, but it certainly didn't have its grip on me anymore like it did. It's interesting.
Yeah. And it shows again, that things are changing, and those are that kind of feedback that we get when we know that we are on the right path and things are progressing. Those moments when we can take a step back, something that we couldn't do before, they can still be painful, but we approach them differently.
Right. And we're empowered. We don't have that helplessness anymore. That for me has been huge too, is I'm not sitting here. I'm not just a product of my circumstance. I'm not stuck in this place and I just have to live like this. And I have to have these, thoughts going through my head. I can actually do something to change this, and it's empowering, and that will build your self-esteem. That will build your confidence. Right. And then the next time makes you more aware. It kind of builds up. It is something you always have to manage and work on, but at least you have tools now. You're not helpless anymore.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And that it's going to make you feel empowered when you realize that you've got choices. It's difficult to get to that point sometimes in life when you realize that you've got choices. And I think that even without trauma, sometimes it's quite difficult when you find yourself, in a job that sucks and, in a bad relationship. And how can you admit that to yourself then, that actually you created the life that you are living right now? But actually on the other side, the positive is that you can change that and you've got that kind of power. But it is a difficult point, and it is difficult to say that to yourself and to admit that to yourself. And I'm thinking, when you experience something traumatic, it's even more complex.
Right. Because I think that, that's the thing about the platform for my podcast, is that it is a platform for people to have a voice and talk about their healing. But there's also people that didn't necessarily have traumatic stuff, but they're dealing with some of the same stuff that we're dealing with, right? As childhood abuse survivors. Self-esteem is one that everybody, man or woman, deals with, right? And so it's wonderful to have a platform where people can have tools and be empowered and know, I can manage this. I can take care of this. I have the power to do this.
Yeah, part of being a human being is that you're going to suffer at some point in your life.
Fortunately,
you're going to have a tough time,
Yeah,
that's the reality. It's just about learning how to manage it better. Every single time we learn a little bit different. And there are different things that challenge us. Like I recently discovered that I'm perimenopausal, and that threw me off in terms of experiencing anxiety with something that I haven't experienced for years.
Yeah.
And then you kind of learn how to cope with that and how to deal with that and what works in this particular time in your life. But I think that, as human beings, we are going to have all those things thrown at us at different times. And it's just, trying to make the best out of it.
Right. And use the tools that will help you. It doesn't take away that situation, but for me, those situations used to be absolutely overwhelming. I wasn't someone that would necessarily freeze, but I wasn't pleasant to be around. I'll put it that way. And that was just the way I coped with it. And not having to feel like that, not having to go to that extreme. Because the thing about that, when you go to that extreme, it's hard to bring yourself down, and it takes time. And it's, as we're getting older, I don't bounce back as easy. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be, just a mess for a day because this thing overwhelmed me so much and I didn't manage it well. And so learning to manage this stuff shortens that pain.
And I've heard someone said, I think when I was doing my existential counseling psychology, someone said that happiness is knowing that you can deal with any circumstances or, whatever life throws at you. And I think that this is so true.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that because it's so realistic, and it is when you've got that kind of sense that, okay, I will be okay. I can cope with that. Life will always, bring something unexpected or difficult.
Right.
It's life. But if you have a sense that you can cope with that, you can deal with that, you've got skills to help yourself in those moments to get through, then you're going to be all right. You're going to feel good. You're going to feel happy.
Right. I love that. That is great. That is so true. Because as you were saying that, I was like, that's exactly what I was thinking. You just put the words to it. It was great. Great. Well, thank you so much, Joanna. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your great wisdom. I would encourage everybody to look at her courses. I'm going to finish the one on self-esteem. I'm excited about that. I could always work on that some more. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. My pleasure.